Good afternoon, Penn Staters, and thank you for joining us. I'm Paul Clifford, CEO of the Penn State Alumni Association, and I'd like to welcome everybody to today's virtual speaker session, which is being recorded. We are encouraging you to participate in today's discussion based on the features made available to you in the audience console. You can view slides, hear the presenter via the main stage, submit questions to the presenter through the Q&A box, view closed captioning, and much, much more. This afternoon, we welcome Penn State English professor and Jeopardy semifinalist Hester Blum to the virtual speaker series. In the summer of 2019, Hester was the lone humanities scholar on the National Science Foundation sponsored Arctic research expedition tracking global warming in the Northwest Passage. Drawn from her experience on the icebreaker, as well as from her recent travel to Antarctica, Blum's talk offers meditation on ice and humanity timelines with a focus on what might be called the humanities of climate change. Hester is a professor of English at Penn State, where she has taught for 18 years. Her recent books include The News at the Ends of the Earth, The Print Culture of Polar Exploration, and a new edition of Herman Melville's Moby. She participated in an Arctic climate change expedition and documentary with the Northwest Passage Project, and she also traveled to Antarctica with Penn State alumni. Her academic honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship and multiple grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. In December of 2021, Blum reached the semifinals of the first ever Jeopardy Professors Tournament. And we're definitely going to ask her about that and all the great work that she's doing at Penn State. Thank you for joining us, and please welcome Professor Blum.
Thanks very much, Paul, and it's a delight to be speaking with all of you. I'm going to start my slideshow. I traveled to Antarctica in January of this year on a cruise ship. The passengers were all affiliated with educational affinity groups, such as the Penn State Alumni Association, who I have the honor to speak with today, which very generously sponsored my travel. My most recent book is on the little-known fact that historical polar expeditions brought printing presses to the Arctic and Antarctica, with which they crafted newspapers, playbills, and other ephemera. And I have broader research interests in the literary culture of polar exploration. I was the first humanities professor that the Alumni Association had sent to serve as a host for Penn State Antarctic travelers. A glaciologist colleague in the earth sciences usually makes this particular trip, and the Alumni Association thought that it would be novel to have a specialist in polar literature and culture on board as a change of disciplinary pace. I should say they thought this was a viable idea in part because I had repeatedly pitched it to Penn State over the course of several years. For those not working at a polar research station, travel to Antarctica is really only possible for travelers with the means to pay $15,000 to $20,000 for a typical voyage. And I usually don't have access to that kind of research budget working in the humanities. After a year-long COVID delay and several variant surges, the trip was on, and only the extraordinary opportunity of venturing to Antarctica made me heedless of traveling in an enclosed space with hundreds of other people during a global pandemic. As it turned out, we had a successful cruise with daily testing, more or less, and no outbreaks. Remarkably, since the port we departed from in Ushuaia, Argentina, was choked with 7 other cruise ships at anchor in quarantine, unable to disembark scores of infected passengers. We boarded the ship in the southernmost city of the world, Ushuaia, and after crossing the Drake Passage, which is the stormiest seas in the world, we made daily excursions in the South Shetland Islands and the Antarctic Peninsula over the course of 11 days. It was otherworldly and stupendous, from the penguins to the whales, to the ludicrous seals. I felt as if we had traveled to Lovecraft's Mountains of Madness, or had glimpsed Poe's and Verne's portal to the hollow earth. And in other literary polar adventures, the intensity of my ancient ancient mariner-esque questions to the crew about whether it was weird to sail on a ship run by a company called Albatross Expeditions was received with a reasonable enough combination of disinterest and irritation. I wasn't entirely sure what was expected from me in my role as neither crew member nor paying passenger, berthed on the same lower deck as the crew's quarters, with a porthole instead of a balcony, but this was obviously luxury decor and exceptionally comfortable situation. I gave a shipboard lecture on Antarctic printing, but I had to shorten the talk on the spot when the 55-knot winds we were experiencing unexpectedly died down, and the expedition leader announced that our Zodiac boats would launch in 30 minutes, and it usually took us about that long to get all our gear on, as you see on the left here, for an excursion to Port Charcot, which has a very large penguin colony and a century-old monument to a French expedition pig named Toby. There's Toby's monument. When we weren't making Zodiac landings to commune with penguins, seals, and whales, we were treated to a series of lectures given by the expedition's crew members. This was the biggest revelation for me aboard ship. The crew members were not just accomplished laboring sailors and not just expert travel guides, they were all these things, but they were also superbly experienced professional polar explorers in their own right. Gerard, the English expedition leader, he's the one with the fabulous beard on the far right in this image, has published 15 books. He's overwintered at South Polar Station 4 times with the British Antarctic Program and helped eradicate the invasive rat population on South Georgia Island, where Ernest Shackleton is buried. David, the Scottish kayak guide, has undertaken over 300 Arctic and Antarctic expeditions, including traversing the fabled Northwest Passage 18 times and riding a fat tire bike across Baffin Island while living for 2 decades in Nunavut. Mariam, the Argentine Zodiac driver, has master's degrees in historic preservation and nautical archaeology. Karen, the Canadian crew member, is a PhD student in nautical folklore, as well as a performance artist. I could go on and on with their amazing bios. Their own shipboard lectures, given 2 or 3 times a day, included topics such as seabirds of the Southern Ocean, the Antarctic circumpolar current, Antarctic geology and continent formation, whether a pinniped's ears and testicles are internal or external, and the underappreciated Scottish explorer William Spears Bruce, as well as why Gentoo penguins are taking over the Antarctic Peninsula from the Adelies. Polar sailors are polymaths, as I know from my earlier research on historical polar expeditions, where lectures, magic lantern shows, and presentations drawn from sailors' promiscuous hoards of knowledge also filled shipboard leisure time. But on the Antarctic cruise, I marveled nonetheless at the heterogeneity of the crew's expertise and interrogated my own. What precisely was I, as a scholar of polar literature, culture, and history, contributing to a ship that already had a lute-playing folklorist for humanistic color? I was reminded of a point about specialization made by the first mate on my previous polar voyage to the Arctic. He said, "I see scientists from a sailor's perspective. Their knowledge is like an icicle. It gets very narrow at the tip." I'm working on a new book about these very questions of polar exploration and humanities research. But the importance of fieldwork to polar humanities study is not always clear to the public, which hears a lot about the science of climate change, but less about the humanities of climate change. I've considered these questions in a series of similar polar voyages in recent years, beginning with 2 weeks I spent in the high Canadian Arctic on a Swedish ice-breaking vessel sailing the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage trip was sponsored by the National Science Foundation and thus had academic credentials and no paying passengers. But on the Arctic voyage too, I was the only humanities scholar. What is the nature of polar research in the humanities? What are its objectives, its data sets, funding structures, research questions, outcomes, and expectations? What is the durational quality of polar knowledge acquisition in an institutional age of funding cuts? I wrote a book on historical polar expeditions without having visited either polar region yet. This is not unusual, and it's reasonable for humanistic study, which expects a lot of research, but does not usually require on-site fieldwork. My prior fieldwork, as it were, took place at libraries and archives and historical societies, where I was not a discoverer of new information, but a grateful beneficiary of the work already done by archivists, librarians, donors, and other institutional cultural heritage workers to collect such materials. Here's an image of some of the polar periodicals I talked about in my recent book. In this book, I drew on from archives, 30 different archives in 6 countries over 10 years, with the assistance of 11 different fellowship and granting agencies, as well as scores of library staff members. I only visited Antarctica and the Arctic, and I have another trip to Svalbard in the Norwegian archipelago, pending in October after multiple COVID delays. I only visited the polar regions, that is, after the book was published, each time with significant logistical and funding challenges, if not actual risk. I had conceived of these polar trips as the vehicles for fieldwork on a new book about ice and human timelines. What I'm coming to realize, though, is that my archive for this new project, the research material I was seeking in the Arctic and Antarctica, lies in the journeys and not in the destinations. This is not a platitudinous realization. It's not the journey, it's the destination. I'm going to insist that this is not just a cliche. 19th century polar exploration was driven by colonialism and imperialism, resource extraction, and the advancement of science. Is it possible for 21st century humanistic study of the polar regions to participate in forms of knowledge gathering that do not replicate the historic harms of exploration? I'm interested, in other words, whether it is possible to practice ethical humanistic polar research and discovery and exploration in an age of ecological and institutional crisis, amid the ongoing centuries-long crises of settler colonial exploitation of indigenous lands and water environments, amid the planetary catastrophe of fossil fuel extractive industries whose depredations bear exaggerated effects in the polar regions, and amid the higher education labor crisis that is on track to make my generation of professors arguably the last to have tenure. This is the journey that I mean, not the destination of what I learned in and about the polar regions, but instead the pathways of knowledge formation and extraction with an eye to the detritus left behind by the infrastructures that carve such paths. You see this in a slide here that talks about how long ago and even now these sustaining relationships happen. Consider how the precipitous decline of polar sea ice in recent years and its current and projected effects on human and non-human life have been documented in a number of recent popular science and environmental books on ice and climate change. Their titles include Our Ice is Vanishing, A World Without Ice, A Farewell to Ice, After the Ice, The Future of Ice, Lines in the Ice, The Right to be Cold. If you remove the word ice from these titles, you can insert any number of nouns facing systemic collapse. English majors, I'm an English professor with declining majors, humanities PhDs, or in the case of Penn State's own university library, acquisitions of new print books, which have not been purchased since 2019. It's been several years of crisis. The language of crisis saturates both climate discourse and reflections on the state of the academic humanities. While environmental and higher educational crises may not occur on the same planetary scale, both are fueled by short-term thinking, marshaling and expending resources for the sake of expedience and profit, rather than doing the work of long, patient readjustments of infrastructure and habits. In Antarctica, with the Penn State alumni and others, I learned from Mariam, the Historic Preservation Expedition crew member, that the Antarctic Treaty stipulates that infrastructure on the continent must be either preserved or removed. It cannot be left to decay. Contamination of Antarctica by outside pathogens or other biota is an extreme biosecurity concern, and we all engaged in elaborate decontamination processes every time we set foot on Antarctic rock or ice. 19 of us jumped one night at the extraordinary opportunity to camp overnight in the open air, no tents on the Antarctic continent. The 100 plus passengers who said no thanks to this opportunity mostly did so because of the biosecurity regulations that stipulated that we could bring no food or beverages, nor go to the bathroom unless we hauled all our waste back to the ship. The huts built on the other side of Antarctica by the human polar charismatic megafauna Robert Falcon Scott and Ernest Shackleton which are maintained by New Zealand's Antarctic Heritage Trust, are the most visible monuments to this preservation stipulation and communicate a fantasy of domesticity and settlement, human habitation, human survival on a continent that has historically borne none of these markers of human survivance. We saw a few more recent structures on our cruise, weather and research stations that may still be in seasonal use, such as this one here. But on the still active volcano Deception Island in the South Shetlands, just north of the Antarctic Peninsula, our expedition encountered industrial ruins of a different kind on the black sand of the caldera. It looked like a film set for an outer space blockbuster, but these instead are the abandoned engines of the commercial whaling industry, which was active on Deception Island between 1904 and 1931, the only shore-based industry to operate in Antarctica to date. The interstellar feel of this place, the sense that we were on another planet looking for extraterrestrial resources to sustain human life, was enhanced by knowing that the whaling industry pushed farther and farther into the polar regions in response to oil demands and whale population decline. A very different logic of human infrastructural preservation and removal was visible in Nunavut in the Canadian Arctic archipelago in 2019 when I traveled there with the Northwest Passage Project. This is not a Penn State expedition. It was a consortium of universities led by the University of Rhode Island, although Penn State's former Polar Center contributed to this mission. When I was in the hamlet of Resolute, one of the permanent settlements to which the traditionally nomadic Inuit had been compelled by the Canadian government to move in the mid-20th century, I saw a series of help wanted posters circulated by Baffin Land Iron Mines Corporation, which promised jobs to economically challenged residents under the appropriated logo of an Inukshuk, an Inuit cairn or communicative landmark. That's the symbol you see in the center of these posters. The opportunities for a lifetime promised by the mining operation, which included not just training and management opportunities, but also Inuit elder support and both English and Inuktitut language operations, took on a different cast in light of other work opportunities advertised in Resolute, removing and containerizing hazardous wastes, low risk asbestos abatement work, and other remediation work. Such scenes are not usually featured on polar cruise itineraries or on slideshows or in other visual rhetorics of polar pristineness. My encounters with human infrastructure had also happened earlier on the 2019 Arctic expedition, but on a different timescale. The Northwest Passage Project, I should say, was a climate change research expedition sponsored by the National Science Foundation and included 2 early career Inuit scientists from Nunavut, 23 American undergraduates from minority serving institutions, and a documentary film crew. One of the stops our icebreaker made was at Radstock Bay on the southwestern coast of Devon Island, the largest uninhabited island in the world, located in the Kikitalik region of Nunavut. Radstock Bay presents itself to the eye as a cross-section of planetary and human temporalities. I spent a morning there during our expedition, accompanied by the documentary film crew and 4 sailors doubling as armed polar bear scouts. From the air, arriving by helicopter from the icebreaker, we could see great sweeping bands of rocks arcing across the bay shore. You see them here in what first appeared to be tidal marks with clear edges between each band, no blurred interpenetration of rock lines. The bands are evidence of what is called isostatic rebound. Also known as post-glacier rebound, isostatic rebound is the continuing upsurge of the Earth's crust after the retreat of the glaciers around 20,000 years ago at the last glacial maximum. During this time, the weight of the ice, which was miles thick, caused the severe compression of the Earth's crust, which deformed and warped downward. After the ice retreated, the pressure on the land eased. Today, the crust is still rising. The post-glacial rebound bands terminate at the northern end of Radstock Bay in a different kind of band, which is a bright green stretch of startling verdancy in a landscape that otherwise is a dull brown expanse of endless pebbles with scant vegetation. But in this patch, we saw mossy, springy, elastic Arctic tundra, which enclosed a string of structures, housing constructed of turf and whalebone, musk oxen bone, and stone, which were circular in structure with an entry aisle. They were originally built by the Dorset people, Paleo-Eskimos who lived 500 to 2,500 years ago, and were later repurposed by the Thule people, who were the ancestral Inuit, who succeeded the Dorset 500 to 1,000 years ago, as well as by contemporary Inuit who camp in the area today. The structures were also used as tent sites by British and American polar explorers in the 19th century. The lushness of this stretch of tundra is a consequence of the nutrient-rich bones and remains of the whales, walruses, musk oxen, and that were eaten and discarded on site by the Dorset, Thule, and Inuit over 2,000 years, which fertilized this frozen ground. Organic waste nourishes the earth. In an earlier stop our expedition had made in Pond Inlet, some trash had been visible throughout the hamlet, drifting down dirt streets and accumulating behind houses. I overheard a visitor remark on this streetscape with distaste, but in light of the Dorset and Thule structures in Radstock Bay, the waste in town registered in another dimension for us. Traditional Inuit practice has been to compost the ground with organic remains, but when garbage is plastic or other inorganic material, it destroys the earth rather than replenishing it. The Canadian permit that allowed our landing at Radstock Bay compelled us to stay 6 feet away from all structures and objects, neither touching nor removing anything. This was our Arctic Canadian guide, Sarah Scriber. These and other similar cultural sites in the high Arctic have not undergone significant historic preservation or archaeological research. It's too cold, it's too far, it's too underfunded a region. We were there on July 21st of that year, and we were the first visitors of the season because the channel's ice was just breaking up. For the research season for such sites can be as short as 6 to 8 weeks without ice. In a further acute indication, rather, of the duration and accumulation of the litter of human travel, the site was also strewn with detritus from 19th century British and American Arctic voyages, many of which were associated with the lost Franklin expedition. And I can say more about that lost mid-19th century British expedition and what it has meant for the history of polar exploration, if you'd like. These expeditions also left their food waste and discarded household implements all over the site. But like the plastic introduced to Pond Inlet, it remains on site, neither enriching the tundra nor extracted for archaeological use or museum display. I had joined this expedition at the invitation of a documentary filmmaker named David Clark, who's kneeling in this image, who conceived of a film on the history of the Northwest Passage and contemporary climate change. Funding such an expedition was a collaborative venture. By 2016, the Northwest Passage Project, in primary partnership with the University of Rhode Island, had secured a $3 million grant from the National Science Foundation to include students and to advance scientific communication about climate change, which included live broadcasts from our icebreaker. The expedition then went through 5 ships in 5 years of planning, the first 4 of those ships either canceling or in emergency dry dock or running aground in an incident that nearly killed everyone on the ship, or recalled by Russia, and an entire class of undergraduate student participants graduated before they could actually experience the Arctic. Polar exploration is never easy. Even in the 21st century, polar expedition remains dangerous and difficult to pull off. Technology gives us the impression of a connected world, but in the 12 days I spent on the Swedish icebreaker Odin, we did not see a single other ship and only one plane, a Canadian military plane on reconnaissance, making sure that our ship had reason and clearance to be in the Northwest Passage and looking for Russian vessels. Outside the Inuit hamlets of Nunavut, we saw zero evidence of human life or infrastructure, no power lines, no telephone wires, no cell towers. The northern towns of Nunavut are fly-in towns, not accessible by road. For all the promise of an ice-free Northwest Passage or Northern Sea Route, these remain hazardous waters, with rescues sometimes impossibly distant. The logistical complications are part of the question of what it means to be a polar humanist among polar scientists. Excuse me. Excuse me. In 5 years of preparation for this Northwest Passage project, I had petitioned nearly monthly to contribute more to the expedition's mission beyond the lectures on Arctic history and literature I was expecting to provide. The Odin had its own mobile printing technologies, including a 3D printer, which the crew used to print plastic trophies of polar bears for the winner and runner-up of the shipwide ping pong tournament. I wish I could have won one of these, I did not. Could I have the students create their own shipboard newspapers like historical polar explorers did? Could I host a reading group or suggest some shared texts for expedition members? No, I was told the students were all committed to their 4 research areas. It wasn't until a few days into the voyage that I realized that no one on the scientific team thought of me as part of their project at all. And not in a hostile way, just I was not part of that project. To them, I was a guest of the documentary team, a talking head for the film, a scholar of background historical information unrelated to the science mission. It was certainly true that my participation was solicited by the documentary team, who liked the idea of having a literary historical scholar and a woman on camera talking about climate change. And the documentary is terrific. It's called Frozen Obsession. You can find it on YouTube or on PBS. But what institutional structures, I've been wondering, what elasticity of vision would have permitted the full project participation of a humanist from the start? It's possible that the multi-year logistical challenges in launching this expedition, its fits, its starts, its jettisoned ships, its near catastrophe, led to a tightening of control over the parameters of the expedition, a caution that led to constricted objectives rather than expansive possibility. What I have not yet said is that none of the students and nor the Inuit scientists on the expedition got to go to Radstock Bay or our few other stops at culturally significant sites in the high Arctic, which were also not part of the science plan. Even more startling, I realized only after the expedition, was that Mia and Gibson, the Inuit scientists, were also excluded from the initial science plans, although they both participated fully in the student experiments. They too were guests of the film crew, part of the vision of the director, not the PIs of the NSF grant. To repeat with a difference, the question I just posed above, what elasticity of vision would have permitted the full project participation of Inuit scientists? Inuit knowledge may not have been part of the original NSF grant, but it asserted itself throughout our Northwest Passage voyage. The 2 early career Inuit scientists who were part of the expedition are Mia Otokiak, seen here, from Cambridge Bay, and Gibson Porter from Joe Haven, both towns in Western Nunavut. They are in their 20s and are members of a remarkable organization called Akarvik, which was started in 2011 in order to involve Inuit youth in Arctic science in a meaningful way. Akarvik is working to address 2 cultural and professional imperatives. 1, empowering Inuit youth to recognize and make use of their own skills and experience in the North. And 2, to recalibrate the relationship that visiting researchers to the Arctic have to local Indigenous populations, which often consists only of hiring Inuit guides or buying supplies. Mia told us Inuit are the first Arctic researchers. We are the first to survive here, the first to learn about the region. When we were on the Odin, Mia laid out for us the recommendations that Akarvik makes to scientists traveling to Nunavut. Get to know the community. Do so through face-to-face meetings. Talk with community members. Be a person before being a scientist. Have your Inuit guide involved in every step of your research. Set up a table in the local community's co-op or northern store for a few hours with handouts explaining what you are researching so you can introduce yourself to the community. The northern or the co-op are one of the general stores that every community in the North has, which usually is the only commercial business in town other than the airport and a hotel. Officials of each hamlet receive hundreds of scholarly scientific papers from outsiders, but in Inuit towns, the best way to disseminate information is on the radio waves. Put an ad on the radio explaining your project and inviting local involvement, Mia advised. Conversations that I had with Mia and Gibson and on these and other research considerations have reshaped my sense of polar humanities research methodologies. Late in our trip, one of the students on the expedition told me that he understood my humanistic perspective better. You spend your life collecting stories, he told me. He intended this warmly, and at the moment I felt proud and understood. It was one of the loveliest things anyone had said to me. But as my conversations with Gibson and Mia have come to make me realize, collecting stories can also be its own form of resource extraction, an intellectual resource extraction rather than fossil fuel extraction. The pictures that I've been sharing with you today are one such form of that intellectual extraction. My polar snapshots participate in figurations of obsolescence staged as spectacular beauty, of comparative isolation, and the relative infrequency of signs of human infrastructure. I'm still collecting stories of polar ephemera, trying to understand what I may look at, what I should leave, and what I might justly report as a sign I saw in Nunavut encourages those who encounter artifacts of the past to do. Before the Antarctic cruise, we were sent a laminated bookmark that offers advice from a glacier. Carve your own path, go slow, channel your strengths, smooth the way for others, keep moving forward, avoid meltdowns, be cool. I am lingering over this somewhat incoherent advice from the glacier. The bookmark attributes agency to glaciers, which is appropriate, especially within an Indigenous context. Moving forward and avoiding meltdowns are urgent challenges for worldwide glaciers, most of which are in rapid liquefying retreat in the face of anthropogenic climate change. But of course, the agents that are restricting glacial forward motion and growth are elided in the bookmark's successories coinages. The bookmark flatters travelers that they share with the glacier an enduring, inexorable form of individualistic forward progress, one that bears its own inner self-regulation. Polar humanities scholarship should resist such linear narratives of progress, in line with current wave of environmental humanities scholarly work that attends to ecological justice, and more particularly to Indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological practice. As Indigenous scholars have shown, what the Western world experiences as present climate emergency is for Indigenous people only the most present iteration on a millennium-long continuum of extractive and genocidal destruction. Humanists might collect stories, as I have done here, but the challenge is how to learn from or use the insights of these stories without replicating the long histories of resource appropriation or extraction. Thanks very much.
And thank you, Hester. We have some questions coming in, but I'd like to start at the beginning and kind of hear from you a little bit about how you first got interested in this line of work, right? The intersections between humanities and science, and kind of what first piqued your interest.
Well, I've been a scholar of maritime literature and culture. All of my previous books have been about sailors reading and writing at sea. And sailors have a robust literary culture. And by necessity, though, they're participating in that literary culture while on their job sites. And their job sites are technical. They are, not all of the vessels that I've studied have been scientific research vessels, but sailors all have a technical knowledge. And so I began by being interested in how technical job knowledge interacts with somebody's imaginative life. And so in many ways, the polar interest has extended from that interest in what it means to do work, to do professional work, while also doing that work at the same place where you're reading and writing and thinking about your place in the world.
But it's still, there's a differentiation between that, what you describe, and technical writing, right? Which is a form of training professionals to write for the sciences so that they're accessible for lay people. Yours still has levels of creativity embedded in it.
Absolutely. No, that's an important distinction. The parts that I have studied and that I've been interested in are what sailors and what people at sea use as both their imagination, the source for their imagination, as a creative outlet. So many writers and artists have been inspired by the sea, have written thematically or metaphorically about the sea, about the polar regions. It's a constant site of inspiration for people who are not professional sailors. So my research question has been, if you are a professional sailor, if you're a worker on the sea or in the polar regions, how would your artistic, literary, creative outlet or response to those regions, what would that look like if you're somebody who actually works in the region? How does the image of the sea register differently when it's not a metaphor for you, but when it's actually the work site?
Yeah. So a couple of questions are coming in here, and I want to take it from two different angles, right? We'll certainly have to address the "is climate change a thing" question, because that seems like very 2022, right? It's a question that unfortunately we get from time to time. I don't want to touch on that one quite yet, but when you write about climate change from a humanities perspective, are there challenges with getting acceptance? So there are challenges with how that is perceived by scientists, perceived by people consuming it.
So what's interesting is that people from the humanities who are thinking about climate are obligated professionally and ethically to read scientific research on climate as part of that work. But I don't know that a lot of scientists feel that part of their own research imperative is to read what humanists say about climate and about its effects on humans. I mean, humanities scholarship in general studies how humans interact with the world and how humans affect and are affected by processes in the world. That's the most broad definition of humanities. What does it mean to be a human? And so for thinking about climate change as a human, you're thinking both about the effects on humans as well as how humans are affecting that climate. Again, I think for most scientists, the thinking through whether it's the history, the ethics, the philosophy of these questions doesn't necessarily occur to them as part of that professional imperative. And so part of what I think those of us who are interested in a field, a super hot field in academia right now called the environmental humanities more generally, is how we can bring our own research questions and research methodologies to these conversations. Just because you can do something, why should you do it? What are the effects of doing something? Whether it's based on technologies, whether it's based on other kinds of practices. So thinking through those human dimensions, those of us in the humanities, again, we read the science to the best of our ability, and we're trying to work more collaboratively with scientists to encourage them to do the same.
So let's take the first part of the question, or the first part of my statement then, and apply it. Mort Rubinson actually asked this question too. Do you encounter people who question the reality of climate change, and how do you respond? I'm sure a scientist might refer to mean temperature or rising and falling ocean, the rising and falling of the ocean, or other kind of scientific. Is there a humanities perspective that you bring to kind of evidence around climate changing existing?
Yes, absolutely. It's a great question. One way that I approach this is through questions of ecological justice. So climate change disproportionately, and this is as widely documented as could be, disproportionately affects Indigenous people, people in developing countries, people who are in poorer areas, people in urban areas. People do not experience climate change in the same uniform way, geographically, economically, on a class, race-based level. It's completely unequally distributed. So part of what a humanities perspective brings to this is thinking about how in some ways, the kind of media erasure of the effects of that climate on those who are not part of either, again, a Western world, the US, the industrialized world, to recognize that the emergency of climate change, again, is affecting people differently. And that there's many different ways I could take those kinds of examples. And clearly you have a lot of, you have a great sense of how to pose those particular questions. But, one particular example is there are a lot of, if you Google Arctic ice caps or glaciers, one of the images you always see is like a polar bear on a melting bit of ice, right? Or there'll be articles about how people in northern towns, usually, again, Inuit or Yupik or Inupiaq and other northern indigenous people are experiencing climate change. And so part of my job as both a humanist and someone who his training is traditionally in 19th century American literature, those images share with 19th century American images this mythology of the kind of vanishing native, like the vanishing Indian figure of the 19th century, that the erasure and obsolescence and decline is a kind of inevitable thing that is in the same way that Westerns present natives as sort of moving off into the sunset. A lot of climate change discourse right now presents Northern Indigenous people as also kind of fading away in relevance. And what that kind of language and imagery does is doesn't provide any evidence of who's causing that to happen and what the effects are. And it also doesn't include those Northern Indigenous people in our present moment as well as in the future. And so that's one of the kind of perspectives that, again, I don't know that scientists have sufficiently thought about, but should be thinking about.
Question coming in from Cam. Cam wants to know, how might those of us in the humanities partner with the sciences to help influence public sentiment surrounding the urgency needed in changing human behavior?
That's a tough one. It's a real tough question. I think on the most basic level, including a variety of disciplinary voices and perspectives in these missions and in this kind of research is imperative. I saw this on both the Arctic voyage as well as on the Antarctic voyage. The intersection of those perspectives was always amplifying everyone's knowledge. And if I'm still in contact with most of the students who were in the Arctic with me 3 years ago, all of whom are now in graduate school and are continuing to do marine and polar science. And every single one of them would say that what they learned the most on this expedition is what they learned from Mia and Gibson, the Inuit scientists. That kind of exchange was transformative for them. And it was transformative within the documentary as well. And so that, I think just those conversations from the very beginning, bringing those perspectives is incredibly important. And the students that were on this expedition, who are brilliant scientists and knew, almost nothing about the history of exploration in that area, and my providing that bit of information, they say, enhanced their understanding of the scientific work they were doing. And my own humanities expertise is hugely amplified by watching them at work as well. So I think involving people from the start in those questions, not having separate silos of information, is really crucial.
So Eve Preston is a clinical psychologist. She would like to know if you could speak to the idea of an outsider, and she used quotes, so I'm using air quotes, an outsider applying for grants or other scientific opportunities that surface that may not seem appropriate. It's around the funding of your work and how it's, how do folks from the humanities get funding for their climate change research and work that they're doing?
It's been a challenge, and it's a lot of legwork and a lot of knocking on doors. There are a few grants here. So the NSF had traditionally had an artists and writers project in Antarctica, which requires about a 4 to 6 month residency. But that's one program, and it's been on hiatus. They're trying to revive it. There are the Arctic trip I'm taking in the fall to Svalbard is sponsored by a residency program called the Arctic Circle. Those are 2 programs only. There are a handful of others. And I'm somebody who I'm a full professor at Penn State. I've won basically every major granting fellowship award that someone in my discipline can win. But for each of these voyages, it's taken me years to get to the point where I have the funding to do so. And so part of what I'm interested in is thinking through, if somebody like me, who is at the most privileged academic position possible, with support of a major research university, which supports my travel, I've been to the polar regions like 2 or 3 times after over 12 years of trying, 13 years of trying. That's a real challenge. And especially in a time when we all know resources are dwindling for this kind of work. So being able to take a chance on bringing along like the literature professor who also writes about Herman, Melville, and Moby Dick doesn't necessarily seem like it would be a calculated risk. And so, especially for students, there are increasingly programs in environmental humanities at many other institutions. Penn State is still kind of ramping that up. But those kinds of programs would help those who are in less privileged positions not have to, wait that decade plus in order to get to those positions.
Her work would be interesting. You referenced the communities that are most affected by climate change, right? It's indigenous people, it's poor, it's different racial and ethnic demographics that are impacted. The psychology of that would be really, the psychology of climate change would be a fascinating study and piece that I don't think people talk about. We think about how the earth is deteriorating, but not necessarily connecting that to how it impacts the people who live on earth.
There's actually a term for it called eco-melancholia that has been coined within psychological discussions, and a lot of people in my field who do environmental humanities scholarship. It's environmental grief, eco-melancholia, environmental grief. I don't know where it stands on the kind of clinical register of diagnosis, but you're right that it has been under discussed in the mainstream, but people are coming up with the terms to think about that kind of grief.
Right. Well, if you're tuning in, thank you for joining us. And you're thinking, I know Hester from somewhere. Where have I seen her before? You may be fans of the game show, the television game show Jeopardy, where Hester was a semifinalist in the tournament, the Professors Tournament, the first ever one. Hester, tell us, how did that come about? What does the Jeopardy journey look like?
It was an amazing, it's still, I can't believe it happened. It started because in the pandemic, I had reconnected with a friend from elementary school who I hadn't spoken to basically since we were in 4th grade. And I've always been a Jeopardy fan. I had gotten called for a tryout for the team tournament when I was in high school. But this is one of the dumber decisions I've made. I decided that I had to go to my state AAU basketball practice instead. It wasn't even a game. Like I skipped my tryout for a practice, which was just not the right decision. But so I hadn't tried out in 30 plus years since then. But my childhood friend said, they just put out a call for professors to try out. You should do this. And I wouldn't have done it if he hadn't encouraged me. And so I did an online test, and then I got called back very quickly for a second online test, which is done. You're given an online test of 50 questions, and they don't tell you how you do, and they don't tell you what the kind of cutoff is. But I thought that I had done pretty well on that. And then they brought a bunch of us on Zoom to take the online test, a different test again, but on our screens, with our screens on, so they could make sure that we weren't consulting with other people or looking things up. And so I got past that format, and then we had a Zoom interview and a practice game. And then next thing I knew, I was called to California, and that all happened within the space of like 2 or 3 months. And we taped in October for a December tournament, and it was totally wild. Tournament play is very intense. There were 12 of us, no, 15 of us, who were professors from every kind of school, from, community college and HBCU and technical college, religious school. Like, it was a huge range of schools, which was awesome. Everyone was fantastic. We're all friends now. And it was wild. 2 days of very intense taping. And I was so fired up from it that I actually ended up in the hospital because I had this blood pressure spike. I don't have high blood pressure, but I was so worked up, I was so adrenalized that I got like super lightheaded, and the Jeopardy producers like put me in an ambulance. And I was totally fine. It was all fine. It didn't affect play, I don't think, but that's how intense of an experience it was. It was wild.
That's amazing. You see some of these. So we're Jeopardy fans. 7 o'clock, we're sitting on the couch just waiting for it to come on. And you see these. Now it seems like they've recently had a string of champions who have won multi-weeks in a row, if you will. What, if any, insight can you give us into how that impacts someone's lifestyle and what that kind of commitment looks like for them to continue to participate in that?
I'm not a multi-day champ, so I wish I could speak to that. But one thing that from what I understand, because they tape 5 shows a day, and they usually tape on Mondays and Tuesdays of the week. And then the rest of the week, they do editing, they do interviewing, they do recruiting, like the rest of their Jeopardy production stuff. And the production staff is amazing. So for the people, who are on multiple days, are usually only traveling 1 or 2 days a week for it, which is clearly disruptive. And I know that some of the mega champs have had to, you're not supposed to talk about being on Jeopardy to anyone until afterward. And so some of those champs have had to tell their employers to get that kind of release time. But it's part of it's such an intense sealed environment, both for security and also because of COVID. Jeopardy's apparently the best show of any of the productions in terms of never having a COVID outbreak, and their protocols were incredibly strict. But that strictness meant that you can't leave the space. You can't kind of go out into the world. We didn't really have many drink or snack breaks, just because they're so careful. And so there's a real physical toll on that. I mean, like, I had the most extreme version of it, but everybody had a real like physical crashes afterward, because you're at maximum intensity and not necessarily having your normal like bodily rest periods. So I think for people who've done that for a long time, it's incredibly challenging, I'm sure.
Yeah, I would imagine that COVID just added to the level of stress, the level of tension. I mean, just watching it, right, you can feel like if it's a close game that there's some natural tension there. I couldn't imagine standing behind one of those podiums and having to answer those questions that it doesn't have like a physical, like that people have physical reactions to it.
Well, part of what was really challenging for me, which I didn't expect. So I was a college athlete. I love performing, and I feel very comfortable with public speaking. So I thought that between feeling comfortable with competition, I don't get nervous for those things. The things I get nervous about have nothing to do with those things. So I thought that I would feel comfortable both performing and competing at the same time. But the Jeopardy version of that was totally unlike speaking in public or being on a court. The intensity was very different. And in part because it's so fast. And as a professor, as you heard me just answer questions, I can take my time. I can think about what I'm saying. You don't get to do that in Jeopardy. But also I had, as people who watch the show know, buzzer speed is 80 or 90% of the game, because most people who make it to the show have a similar body of knowledge, a similar capacity to answer the questions or to give the answers. Some of the mega champs are clearly a little smarter than everybody else, but most people are equally smart. But it all comes down to how fast you are on the buzzer. And my buzzer speed was much faster than I was expecting it to be. I don't play video games. Like, I don't have a lot of experience with clickers. So I thought that I would be I didn't think I would be fast, but I was faster than I expected. And then I would find that I was so focused on being fast on the buzzer that I hadn't really fully listened to the question. And
Right.
so that combination of like the physical speed versus like thinking like, oh shit, like what was the question? What am I asking? You know, that was really, that threw me off. And so when you see people make dumb mistakes, often I think it's that kind of moment. You're so focused on the buzzer game that you're not necessarily processing the question.
Yeah, we see that all the time, right? And we're like, what were they thinking? And it's like, well, they weren't thinking. They were thinking about something else,
Yeah.
and then trying to react. And yeah, it's pressure that that we probably all can't fully appreciate unless we're on the Jeopardy stage. Hester, I want to thank you for joining us and allowing us to pass your story on to Penn Staters. I appreciate your presentation and your willingness to join us and to entertain some questions about America's favorite game show as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate it. And I'm grateful for the chance to do so.
As a reminder to all you viewing in, you can view the full listing of all of our events online and in person at alumni.psu.edu/events. Thank you for your support and all you do for the university, for the glory, and for the future. We are
Penn State.